could not have happened the way they did if there weren't some very brave soldiers, militiamen, part-time soldiers, who lived in Atlantic County, what's now Atlantic County, who participated. The time period, November 1776 through January 1777. Listen to this quote from David Hackett Fisher in Washington's Crossing. Actually, he says, the story was more tangled with underplot than an old Spanish tragedy. It involved 3 marching American armies, plus a patchwork 4th Army, that's the guys from here, 2 quarreling Hessian colonels, 1 incompetent British commander, and a beautiful widow in the village of Mount Holly. Ordinary people in New Jersey came together to do something about their lost liberty. They were unable to break the grip of the conqueror in their state, but they created an opportunity for the Continental Army. Bands of New Jersey militia were roaming the countryside, and the Pennsylvania Navy controlled the river itself below Trenton Falls. There's the prelude. Girl. Sir William Howe said this: the chain, he meant the chain of groups of his soldiers, I own, is rather too extensive, but trusting to the general submission of the country to the southward of this train, that's us, and to the strength of the corps placed in these advanced posts, I conclude the troops will be perfectly safe. Well, listen to what the general of the New Jersey militia said. Many people in New Jersey were growing very angry at the British and German invaders who were attacking their houses and plundering their property. They were ready to do something. Colonel Griffin, he's a guy from Virginia. His command was messed up. He lost most of it in the retreat across New Jersey. He gets a bunch of people together. They tell him about a bunch of people from Gloucester County. He jumps in, takes control, and he says that, and this is said by a spy about him. There were not above 800 at Mount Holly, nearly 1/2 boys and all of the militia, a few from Pennsylvania accepted. He knew many of them who came from Gloucester, Egg Harbor, Ends Neck, and Coansey. They were commanded by Colonel Griffin. That wasn't found, by the way, until recently. It was found in the Dunnock papers, which were found in Germany and had to be transcribed. Harold? Another person, Private Cornelius McCullum, in about 1830, wrote this about his service in order to get his pension. He was from what we call Atlantic County. He said there was a call for all the militia to go out. The British were overrunning much of the Jerseys. I volunteered for 6 months in a company under the command of Captain David Weatherby and Lieutenant Richard Higby. I was the sergeant. We were accompanied by Colonel Richard Summers. Elijah Clark was Lieutenant Colonel. Richard Westcott was Major. We went to Mount Holly. And I put at the bottom in John Tilton's pension application, from which we get Tilton Road, by the way, and adds that the company marched from Randallboro, that's Port Republic today, up to Hatfield, and then turned north and went to Mount Holly. Yeah, another person, the brother of the other person, Private Patrick McCullum, also from Atlantic County, says, I entered the service in the month of November '76, about the 20th of the month, as a private in a company commanded by Captain Payne and Colonel Summers' regiment. We paraded at Randallboro, marched from there to Blue Anchor. Now we find out what their rest stop was. Haddonfield, we remained about a week, and there we went to Mount Holly. It's always more interesting when you hear from the people themselves what they did, right? Private Lucas afterwards volunteered in the company of Captain Joseph Estelle of Estelle Manor, belonging to the regiment of Colonel Elijah Clark. His brother was a lieutenant in the same company and was wounded in a skirmish with the enemy at Petticoat Bridge. Earl and I visited Petticoat Bridge. It's right off 206, going up past, you know, where Columbus Martin's up there, where you can buy all the stuff that you can then take home and stock up for your next yard sale. You know how that works, don't you? Yeah, go on. Here's what happened. First of all, when we reconstruct the 3rd Battalion of the Gloucester Militia under Colonel Summers, we can only reconstruct what we know. We can't surmise and create truth out of what we don't know. So the names that you see here are people that we know for a fact fought in these battles. We know some of the privates. You can see them listed here. There were about 175 more. And we know all of the officers down to their lieutenants and in some cases one sergeant because we just read his pension application. Here's what happened. If I can come up here on this side, this is Morristown. This is Haddonfield. Here is Mount Holly, and up here is Trenton, Bordentown. The call goes out for soldiers. Now remember, in those days, the militia was called up for a month. If you were called up for a month, or thereabouts, till the battle was over, you then went home and you were off from it. And the other half of the Atlantic County volunteers in the militia went on active duty for the month. So you see how the militia or the reserves worked those days? They're kind of very much like the reserves today, where we send our reserves over to Iraq, Afghanistan, etc. What happened is they were called up, they went up to Haddonfield, that's where they meet this Colonel Griffin, and then they turn and they head up and head toward Mount Holly. Now, meanwhile, what's happened? During this time, Washington has come down from New Jersey, chased by Cornwallis. Had the British generals let Cornwallis go and taken the leash off him, you would be speaking with a British accent today. He was the general of the war, but they wouldn't take the leash off, and I'm happy about that. Washington finally crossed over to Pennsylvania. He now only has about 3,000 troops that can actually fight, no matter what the numbers say. He knows that many of them, their time is up on December 31st. That he either has to do something, or as he said, the game is up. So what happens is something begins to happen that nobody expected. You see, when they came down through North Jersey, the militia didn't show up. They were worried about their own farms. But in South Jersey, and not all of South Jersey, Burlington didn't show up. Cumberland kind of showed up. Salem was invisible. Cape May didn't get the letter yet. Gloucester showed up. The 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Battalion, which we were the 3rd. And this show-up gave Washington exactly what he needed to pull off Christmas night, 1776. By the way, you can have copies of anything you want from this, or else we'll go to the next. Sure, we'll go back. Just a second. And what's also now happening, as they hear the South Jersey's rising, way up there, Hunterdon County, the guys out in sticks, start saying, we're not giving up anything to those Brits. Let's go get them. So they start tearing up the British from the north. Ewing starts running over the river and driving this guy Rawls, who is at Princeton, who's at Trenton, crazy. So all this is happening while the British main command is sitting in New York City, smoking a pipe, having a glass of wine, and whatever else they did in the winter, because they sure didn't fight. Earl, here's the timeline. And I think you have to get a timeline in your mind. Now just tolerate me on this, and I think you'll appreciate it. November 20th, the call goes to Gloucester County Militia. Call up. Half of it goes. It's called up. December 7th, the American Army under Washington retreats across the Delaware. December 8th, the Hessians take over Burlington, and the Americans, what's left of them, retreat down toward Mount Holly. The 11th, the Hessians made mistake number 1. They divided their forces. They put part of them at Trenton, and part of them at Bordentown, and part of them at Burlington. At that particular point, about 2,000 of them occupied Trenton. Another 2,000 or actually 3,000 are further south. In Pennsylvania, Colonel Ewing is harassing them constantly. 4 times in 4 days he upsets them. Major General Dickinson, the head of all militias in New Jersey, is constantly getting intelligence. What can we do? What's going on? December 17th, Virginia Colonel Samuel Griffin gets tired of doing nothing. And he collects a few Virginians, a few Pennsylvanians, and about 600 Gloucester County militia, of which ours were a couple hundred. And he moves to Mount Holly. Now, he doesn't know what he's going to do. He just knows he's got to do something. A bored soldier is a soldier that's going to pick a fight somewhere. If you were ever in the military, there is nothing worse than hurrying up and waiting. 21st, Griffin decides, first of all, he gets a note from Washington that says, you need to do something. Stir up something. I need a diversion. So what he does is he attacks, he moves his troops up from Mount Holly, halfway to Bordentown and Black Horse, and gets them in there and goes, And the British couldn't take that. And so what do? They come out, and at Petticoat Bridge, there is a battle. And we have a couple Americans that are wounded there. Earl Kane's Patriot ancestor, and this other Lucas fellow were wounded there. We don't really know how many people were killed. We have different stories, but we can't do it. Well, what happens is the the Hessian colonel decides, I'm going to fix them. I'm staying at Mount Holly. Well, in Mount Holly, there is a young widow. And evidently, she looked pretty good. And evidently, she was pretty friendly. Nobody really knew who she was. We're still not 100% sure. But then, the colonel's diary showed up. And the diary of his executive officer showed up in Germany. And we find out that she is young. She is from Philadelphia. And her husband was a doctor. There was only one recorded widow of a doctor that was young from Philadelphia, from Washington, D.C. to Boston. And her name was Betsy Ross. Was it Betsy? Did she do more than just make flags? Did she take out the British officers? I can't tell you for sure, but whatever she did, she had this guy there. He wasn't moving and his troops weren't moving. And that is what gave Washington the chance to win on Christmas night, 1776. The reinforcements couldn't get there. When the messengers went out from Colonel Rawls and Trenton and went to Bordentown to get reinforcements, there weren't none there. They were down waiting for their colonel to get done with his whatever he was doing in Mount Holly. So, did she do it? I don't know. George Washington receives the good news of Griffin's diversion, plans the attack. Christmas night, they go across, and a providential storm comes. We say it was horrible. They would have never gotten the drop on without the storm, and never gotten the drop on without all these things. The Hessians were exhausted. They just wanted to go to sleep. They wanted to have a Christmas party, get drunk. And you know, when you get drunk, I don't know how many of you here have had the unfortunate experience of having a hangover. But you don't hang out well with a rifle in the morning when you are hungover from the night before, do you? 26 December, Washington attacks. You probably know the story, girl. Margaret Morris writes in her journal, it's in Haverford College, it was published in 1949, all the women removed from town, the town of Mount Holly, except one widow. Yeah, the Hessian Captain Ewald's diary, the executive officer. He says, the Colonel Donna, who was exceedingly devoted to the fair sex, He wanted to set up his rest quarters in Mount Holly, which to the misfortune of Colonel Rawl, he was permitted to do. This great misfortune would surely cause the utter loss of the 13 splendid provinces of the Crown of England, was partly due to the extension of the cordon, partly due to the fort of Colonel Donop, excuse my misspelling here, who was led by the nose to Mount Holly by Colonel Griffin and detained there by love. Thus, the fate of entire kingdoms often depends on a few blockheads and irresolution. That was one of the executive officers of the Hessian forces writing that about his colonel. And by the way, Trenton is what turned the war. Freedom fighters come in all sizes, all shapes, all sexes, and all races. Passion and stupidity, however, often go hand in hand. Here's what happens. The Hessians set up at Petticoat Bridge because our guys had moved up. Our guys hit them. They attacked them. They don't wait. They go out and they attack them. The British never expected militia boys to attack them. They bring in all their troops now. Now they've got them all in, and our guys pull back. Now you say, wait a minute, why did they do that? This was Washington's plan. If you read his Fabian's plan, it was never go into battle where you can lose a battle. Hit them on the side, and wait till they come in to where you can only win, then fight. Washington was the best retreat artist we have ever had. That's why he was able to win the war. Had he taken the British on head on, we were no match for them. But Egypt wore him out. Our guys keep it up, keep it up. They move, they do the same thing to him at Mount Holly. He stays at Mount Holly. The widow steps in, locks him in there with love. By the way, Black Horse is now Columbus. Slabtown is now Jacksonville, if you were ever reading that. Earl and I walked through the woods right in here. There's a sign there on the side of this side road. And one day I'd like to go in there with a metal detector, just see what's in that swamp. In the dry season, of course. Here's what it looks like on a land map. The British are here. Here's Petticoat Bridge. They come down and into the creek. The battle is fought there. They move back. Another battle is there. And then they finally move back to Mount Holly. Earl? This is what's said afterwards. It is said by Private Stephen Ford, Earl's relative, in his pension application in 1833. He was serving under Captain Estelle when this happened. Sometime after the Battle of Petticoat Bridge between the Americans and the Hessians, while stationed at the said village of Slabtown, and at a time when this declarant was standing a sentinel, he was wounded in the knee by a Hessian, being disabled by his wounds from active service. As far as I can tell, the only ones we can prove were wounded were Stephen Ford and Simon Lucas, both recovered. However, Ewald says 2 Hessians and 2 British soldiers were wounded. He says 100 Americans and 100 Hessians were killed at Mount Holly. That may be an exaggeration to cover up their foolishness. He also says that 200 Americans were taken prisoner in the aftermath. There's no evidence of that whatsoever. I think what he is doing 20, 30 years after the fact is starting to run Trenton and Princeton and everything together the way we all do in our minds. But it kind of gives you an idea of what happened. Sure? Here's my equation. Petticoat Bridge, mini victory and delay, plus Mount Holly delay and continued presence, plus a stupid decision of the heart, led to 2,000 plus Hessians that could not help out during or after Trenton. That led to a key American victory and a psychological turnaround in the War for Independence. And that was thanks to Colonel Summers and his men. By the way, the story about the widow comes from the Gloucester County Historical Society Bulletin of 1979. Joseph Tustin is a retired military officer. He is the one that found the Ewald diary in the collections in Germany when he was stationed there and translated it. Earl? The capture of the Hessians. The Hessians lost 918 men, 22 were killed, 83 seriously wounded, 896 taken prisoner. The Americans lost none, with only 4 wounded. That's pretty good fighting, all because the help was lured away. Colonel John Cadwalader writes to General Washington on 9 p.m. the next night. General Putnam was to cross at Philadelphia today if the weather permitted with 1,000 men. 300 went over yesterday and 500 Jersey militia are now there, as Colonel Griffin informs me today. These corps compose a formidable force. The plan would be more complete if General Putnam was 1 day's march advance. This would cause a diversion that would favor any attempt you may design in the future and would expose the British, and Hessian baggage and stores if they attempt to cross. The militia will be kept easier together by being in motion, and we shall have some service from Colonel Hitchcock's brigade, whose time of enlistment will be up in a few days. I am, sir, with great respect, your most obedient, very humble servant, John Cadwalader, was the leader of the Philadelphia troops. Basically what he's saying is, Mr. George, we got them on the run. We've got more of the militia over there now. Let's get them again. And evidently, Washington heard this from one of his trusted people and must have said, maybe that's a good idea. A chaotic week ensued. Von Donop retreated to Princeton, and then a whole lot further. Cadwalader moved 1,800 troops into New Jersey the day after he wrote that letter. A plan was hatched the very next day to attack the British, just what Cadwalader suggested. George Washington recrosses on the 29th. British prisoners that he had caught helped him get over, and delaying units were sent up the road to Princeton, where all the British soldiers were, while Washington retook Trenton again. Come on. As the British start to come, guess what? All the American units are in place. And now Cadwalader picks up all of our guys and do an overnight march to join Washington the very morning when the British are now starting to come in. Earl? Look what George Washington says. He says, the Army of the United States under my command being lately greatly reinforced and having again entered the state of New Jersey, I most warmly request the militia of said state in this important crisis to evidence their love to their country by boldly stepping forth and defending the cause of freedom. The inhabitants may be assured that by a manly and spirited conduct they may now relieve their distressed state from the depredations of our enemies. I have therefore dispatched Colonels Nielsen, Major Tyler, Van Emberg, and Frelinghuysen, together with some other gentlemen of your state, to call together and embody your militia, not doubting but success will attend their endeavors. And evidently more showed up yet. Earl? John Hancock writes to George Washington, I have sent into different parts of Jersey men of influence to spirit up the militia, and flatter myself that the many injuries they have received will induce them to give their aid. If what they have suffered does not rouse their resentment, they must not possess the common feelings of humanity, to oppression, ravage, and a deprivation of property. They have had more mortifying circumstances of insult at it. The Hessians just came up to houses, took everything they wanted. In a lot of cases, wives and daughters were raped. The British soldiers and the Hessian soldiers were not good guys. They were used to just ravaging an area. And they made the mistake of doing it. And when they did, the farmers, and in this county, most of them were Quakers, became fighting Quakers. And they said, that's enough. And they came up, and they began to fight. By the way, everything I've given you, we even have a page number on these letters. They're all in the different library stock and printed in different places. Earl, next slide. Here's what occurs. If you see this black line, it starts at Princeton, and here come the British coming down on January 2nd to chase this upstart George Washington and those farmers harass them, shoot them from the side, shoot them from the woods, shoot some cannon at them, and then disappear into the swamps. Takes them a while to get started. They start up again. Same thing happens down here. Starting to get a little edgy now. Every time you don't walk by a tree, you're afraid it's going to explode with a gun. They finally get down here, and right across the creek is where the battle ends that day. Washington, the Cornwallis cannot force the bridge. And I never know how to pronounce that word. Assipunk or something like that, three? I'll get it one day down. I sometimes struggle with words like that. As that, just before that's happening, everything's coming up from South Jersey, and then the night march. Oh, excuse me. I'm sorry. Let's erase that. I'm back to myself. The British are down. The sun goes down. George Washington is slick. He is one of the sneakiest characters in American history in a good way. He's brilliant as a general. He takes his people and he has them light bonfires. And he has them make noise. And every once in a while he shoots lots of cannonball into the British troops. And they lob one back. And what he does is when it freezes at night, he can now get out. There's no more mud. And what he does with his locals is he takes them and does an end around. You know how in football the end goes around? It's a great military move. It's been done for centuries and centuries and centuries. He leaves a bunch of people here tending the fires, keeping them up and making noise. The rest of them, a couple thousand troops, maybe 3,000, come all the way around in a night march. And in the morning, show up in Princeton to the great dismay of the British who were there, Earl. The fellow that I'm related to, one of them, Jeremiah Leeds, wrote this. We retreated back to Haddonfield, staying one night in Morristown and remained in Haddonfield a very short time. Then we marched to Bordentown, remaining all the morning of the Battle of Trenton. That morning we marched to Trenton and were in the battle there on January the 2nd. They missed the first, got to the second one. Early the next morning we marched to Princeton, our company being in the rear of the army. We were not in the active part of the battle at that place. They were the reserve, that particular company at that particular time, Earl. Cornelius McCullum, who we heard to before, says this: we marched to Trenton and joined General Washington's army in the morning of the day after having marched all night from Bordentown and took part in the engagement with the British. The Americans had 14 field pieces on that occasion, 6-pounders and 9-pounders that General Washington had taken from the Hessians. The British tried 3 times to force the bridge on that day and tried to cross the bridge below the village. Captain Weatherby's company was stationed to cover the artillery, staying alongside the pond. The Americans marched off in the night and went to Princeton and had a battle there that day. The American army under Washington got to Princeton about sunrise. General Washington took command, because remember, the army collapsed when he wasn't there. The General Mercer was killed there. Took command and drove the British. The action lasted about 2 hours. General Mercer was killed on this occasion. The Americans took about 450 prisoners besides the wounded there and sent them and the Hessians to Pennsylvania. So Trenton 1, Trenton 2, and now Princeton. And John Tilton writes, we reached Trenton early in the morning. The engagement began in the afternoon and continued until dark. I was in it the whole time. Patrick McCullum writes, during the battle, a man from the neighborhood named Forrest Belanger had his leg shot off while he was standing between Richard Steelman and me. At Trenton, Robert Leeds writes, after the skirmish was over, the Americans had orders to take up themselves up fires, and at the same time in the night they were ordered to Princeton. We had an engagement in Princeton. The company which I belonged to was in the rear during the engagement. Fred Belanger was shot down by his side. He was killed in action, by the way. And Enoch Yankee writes, a short time after we joined the Army, the British cannonaded Trenton, also in the state of New Jersey. I was not immediately engaged, but was one of the reserve. Immediately after the Battle of Trenton, we marched for Princeton, 10 or 12 miles above Trenton. Harold? What happened is, when Washington hit Trenton, hit Princeton, he took all of the prisoners and his own troops, and he didn't wait for the bigger British unit to come. Remember, that wasn't Washington's MO. What would he do? He'd get off and wait for another day when he could win. So he took them all the way up and into the mountains around Morristown. And meanwhile, the British at this point had enough. They backed up, and by the time they were done, they backed all the way up to New Brunswick. And they did not come down. And South Jersey and Middle Jersey and most of North Jersey, other than some food finding hunts, were out from under the British for a while. All of our companies from this area, though, didn't go to the same place. 2 companies, under George Payne and David Weatherby, went up to Morristown and spent that terrible winter with some of our guys from here. 3 companies, the Estelle Company, the Higbee Company, and the Zephaniah Steelman Company, returned to Egg Harbor for the winter, and Captain Richard Higbee's company went to Burlington and stayed there to make sure that the British wouldn't come back. So you see, we were really quite involved in the whole situation. Enoch Gandy again writes, after the Battle of Princeton, they went into the winter quarters at Morristown. They didn't cease Morristown until late spring of '77, being engaged in chastising refugees. That means British loyalist Tories. They were called refugees. Whenever they could have an opportunity. Robert Leach writes, after the Battle of Princeton, he went up to the Delaware, to a place called Millstone, and then up on the side of a mountain to a place called Pluckerman. He returned home from Pluckerman. You know what has amazed me? Out of the probably 300 or so people that served from this area, I've been able to collect 30 written pension applications, written 1838 to 1833. About a third of them were indecipherable. That was my excuse to buy a huge computer monitor. My wife, I can't believe she bought that, but she did. And she and I sat there, and with words that big, were able to transcribe them all and correct them all. And it's just amazing how accurately these men remembered what happened 40 years later when they were in their 70s. I think what happens is when people are in war, or anything like that, there are impressions placed in their minds that never grow dim. And they just really all agree as to what happened there. Cornelius says the American Army went to Morristown, stopped at Somerset the first night, and the next night stopped at Pluckerman. The volunteer company under Captain Weatherby was attached to Major Ellis Battery and General Dickinson's brigade. The field officers who commanded them before had returned home with the militia under their command after the Battle of Princeton, since their time was up. Jeremiah Leeds says, after the battle, we remained a few days at Princeton and then marched back by Trenton and Burlington to Haddonfield, where we were discharged after having served at least 1 month and a half. Carol? Here's the bottom line. The British chased Washington, as we know. Washington beat bad in New York City, Long Island, Lower New York City, Harlem, up into the White Plains, crosses over the Delaware, loses the fort on the New York side, has to surrender the fort on the New Jersey side, and retreats with his army all the way down through New Brunswick, finally into Princeton, Trenton, and then over to Pennsylvania. Everybody really thought the revolution was over. They were ready to pack their bags and go home. You can only get beat so many times. But the problem was, you had some leaders that were not able to be dominated. And they were just waiting for an opportunity. And the opportunity came when the call went out to the group down here, in what we call Atlantic County, who before this time were busy snatching British merchant ships off the coast of Atlantic and Ocean County, running them up to Chestnut Neck, selling them, sending all the supplies up to Philadelphia, the supply yard. They responded. Gloucester County from around what we call now Cherry Hill, Woodbury, responded. And that group came up here and drew about 2/3 of the Hessians off Trenton. Washington captured Trenton. You know the story. It was just stunning. The British couldn't believe it. If that's not bad enough, Washington comes back a week later and does it again. And now everybody in New Jersey's charged up, and the British are saying, we could lose the whole deal right here if this whole state swells up. And so they got out of Dodge. Washington outsmarted the British when he went to Princeton. And then, of course, nothing happened for the rest of the year. But that's when the American Revolution was turned around from failure to the beginnings of success. Oh, it was 5 more years until we hit Yorktown. But our group of people answered the call. Again, we know who some of them were. We know that there were wounded. Before the war is over, we end up with about 6 wounded and 2 men killed, at least, from Atlantic County, maybe as high as 5 or 6. But this is what happens in a revolution.